And this is about two very unlikely friends. Why Pissarro and Cezanne? Well, it started out as a personal interest of mine. I've always liked Pissarro's work, and of all the Impressionists, I just find him to be satisfying in terms of his stability and his consistency and the quality of work. It seems so much more even than most of the other Impressionist artists over a long period of time. Cezanne, I was first introduced to in 1968 on an art history tour to Europe. We visited his house and studio in Aix-en-Provence, and then at the end of the semester, one of the questions on the final exam was write an essay to justify why Cezanne should be considered the father of modern painting. And then in the late 70s, I was the curator of a small museum in Texas during the time when Cezanne, the late work, was in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. And I gave a talk on that, and as a prelude before we took a tour, a group of the patrons to that show in New York. So both of these artists have been important to me. And a few years ago, I put together a talk and was struck by, I don't think I realized before that, how much Pissarro had influenced Cezanne and how close they were. And in the preparation for this work, I found that I actually didn't know about. In 2005, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, there was an exhibition of Pissarro and Cezanne. Interestingly, Pissarro's great-grandson was the curator at MoMA and he was the one who put that show together. So it was really a great find to find that catalog and to see that exhibition had been put on, and it certainly made it a lot easier to do the work on this talk tonight. So what we're really interested in doing is trying to figure out how Cezanne became the father of modern painting. And I would like to make a case that he wouldn't have been, and he wouldn't have risen to that stature had it not been for Pissarro. Setting the stage at the beginning, the early part of the 19th century and up through mid-century, there were really three art movements in France. One, classicism, and Ingres is the one that I think illustrates that style. Delacroix with romanticism, and then Corot and Courbet for realism. And as an example, here is Ingres' work. The drawing on the left shows his attention to line. He was very much interested in drawing and line. Then the portrait painted on the right. Classic style. This is someone from nobility. There's no action, there's no motion, but it's very, very well painted. It's an extremely beautiful painting, but is very characteristic of the classical style. Romanticism, very different. Here's a portrait of Delacroix on the right, and on the left is the death of Sardanapalus. And I don't know whether you know the story of Sardanapalus, but he was the last Assyrian king, and he was decadent. He paid no attention to his empire or doing anything productive except having fun. And this was a popular story among romantics. Lord Byron wrote a play. Hector Berlioz wrote a cantata for Sardanapalus, or about Sardanapalus, and Franz Liszt didn't complete it, but it was worked on an opera of the same subject. Here, Sardanapalus, the king, is reclining on his bed. The enemy has surrounded the castle. He's brought in all of his concubines and his slaves and even his horses. and they're being murdered while he sits there nonchalantly watching this terror, and the flames are lapping up around the room. They're all going to be burned to death shortly. So this is exciting romantic stuff, and Delacroix is right at the heart of it. For Marilyn Hudson, I thought this was a good example of the difference between the classical style and the romantic style. These are both portraits of Paganini. Marilyn was gracious enough to help support the violinist Robin Bollinger coming to play with the Helena Symphony recently. And we had a chance to hear her play a little bit of Paganini. And Ingres, on the left here, treats it in his classical way. You know, Paganini's stiff and upright, and there's not much activity. Delacroix, of course, takes the opposite approach and tries to show this exuberant violinist. And at the time, the work that Paganini performed and what he composed, very, very few other violinists were able to play his work because it was so active and so involved. So this is, I think, a good comparison between the classical and romantic style. One of my other favorite painters is Courbet, the realist. And there's a photograph on the left, and on the right, Courbet is the out for a hike. Probably this is his painting backpack. He's going to go out and paint in plein air. And as a realist, we don't see nobility. We don't see antique or classical references to allegories from mythology. Here are some people passing each other on the trail. And we have this gentleman who's greeting him, and his manservant behind carrying some things for him, and even a dog. Now the dog, you know, that just wouldn't appear in a typical classical painting. But realism, remember at this time in the mid-1800s, the invention of the camera has had a huge impact on what people see and what they're interested in doing. So realism is capturing the everyday scenes. This is not King so-and-so or you know, someone from mythology. These are just local friends. And Courbet with his beard sticking straight out, saying hello to them, and they're greeting him, "Bonjour, Monsieur Courbet." Courbet was quite an important influence at this time. Students came to Courbet and asked if he would take them on as an instructor. And he was very reluctant to do that because he was not at all enamored with the academy, the École des Beaux-Arts. He had lost faith in their ability to promote new ideas and new art. And so he agreed to work with students only as a collaborator, not as an instructor. So this was something that was very different from the way art had been transmitted prior to that. One of the interesting stories was that when the students did initially gather to try to work with him and him to be their collaborator on developing their art skills, instead of using classical sculpture or bringing in models for them to work with, he hired a peasant to bring a bull into the studio, and they used that bull as the subject matter. So he was somebody who was on the cutting edge and was a real rabble-rouser. And I think it fit in so nicely with this whole, what we call zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. Dissatisfaction with what was going on at the academy, people not happy with the quality of work that was coming out of there. Remember, this is also after the Industrial Revolution starts to take hold, so we see artists moving into Paris. People had some disposable income, so there were not only was the population increasing, but there were people who had more affluence, which a portion of them, people who wanted to become artists, could be supported by their families or have the resources to be able to devote their lives to art. And Courbet was right in the middle of all of that, encouraging artistic freedom and encouraging people to break out. And of course, the two of the people who fell under Courbet's spell and were influenced by that, Pissarro and Cezanne. Now, in order to be a successful artist in France up to this point, you needed to have an acceptance in one of the annual salons. And those were started in the 18th century. Every year, people would apply to the salon. There would be a selection committee, primarily made of people who were members of the academy, who taught at the Academy of Fine Arts. And the exhibitions were held here at the Palace of Industry. I've been hoping that Chris would start hanging shows like this here. We could cram so much more work in these galleries. This is a photograph of the Salon of 1855, and you can see there were literally thousands of works of art that were submitted to the Academy for the Salon every year. And this happens to be just a photograph of the corner of one of the galleries, but you can see, I don't know whether any of you have noticed, but I've been in several museums in the last year where they're beginning to, not to this extent, I mean, this is way over the top, but where they're beginning to hang galleries with many more paintings, and then not using labels, but having a panel or something in the middle of the room that has the images numbered, and so there's much more on display than there has been traditionally in the past. So the Salon of 1855, this is just an example to show how busy it was and how it was hung. But we want to give our attention to the Salon of 1863. This is Napoleon III, who is the emperor of the Second Republic. He was actually elected president in 1848 after the revolutions of 1848. France, he was the first person to be elected president. He served 3.5 of his 4-year term, realized that because of the Constitution, he wasn't allowed to run for another term, so he declared himself emperor and set up the Second Republic. And so here he is as the Emperor Napoleon III rather than the president. He holds the honor of being the first president of France and the last emperor, both. Not in the order that you would expect, however. So he's concerned with the political situation. There were people who were not happy about him becoming emperor and setting up another republic. So he's a little bit on shaky ground politically. When the applications came in and the works were submitted to for the Salon, 2/3 of the works that were presented were excluded. They weren't accepted by the selection committee. A total of about 2,200 works were selected. So you can see there were a lot of pieces that were selected, but another 2/3 were refused. Well, Napoleon III was petitioned by people who were unhappy about that. There was a lot of public outcry about the number of works that were refused. So he directed that they would set up another space within the Palace of Industry to have the Salon des Refusés. And this was an opportunity then for the public to make decisions about what art they liked and what they didn't. And of course, it was a double-edged sword for the artists, because if they withdrew their work, if they didn't put it into the Salon de Refusés, they were essentially saying, well, I don't think I'm good enough to do that. If they did put the work in, did submit, then they had to withstand the comments of the public and the evaluation of other people who would see it. So about 430 and 780 works from about 4,000 that had been refused were put in the Salon de Refusés, and a number of people whose names you would know, Manet, Courbet, of course, Cezanne and Pissarro were able to show their works there, but they were not all well received by the public. Probably one of the most controversial, of course, was this Manet Luncheon on the Grass. And this is a famous painting that we're all familiar with, where we have two men lounging in a picnic scene. Again, think about realism versus classicism. This is not Olympia and somebody, or Paris and Aphrodite, or whoever the the mythological characters would be. These are a couple of Frenchmen out for a picnic with a couple gals, and one of them's sitting there naked, and the other one's bathing in the river with something flimsy on. And this really created quite an outrage. Again, an example of pushing the limits, and something that certainly would not have been selected by the selection committee in the École des Beaux-Arts, but was quite an important piece in terms of pushing the envelope and getting the general public to be introduced to a whole new daring approach to painting. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Manet, although probably everybody here is, but sometimes people get Manet and Monet confused, and so I'm Monet. Who the hell is Manet? This was from a New Yorker calendar page recently, and when I turned the page that morning to see this, and I was working on this lecture, I thought of the Rolling Stones, and you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you get what you need. I couldn't resist putting this in. So let's talk about Pissarro and Cezanne. Here's a portrait of Camille Pissarro. Early life, interesting backgrounds. He was born in St. Thomas in the West Indies, and St. Thomas was owned by the Danish at the time, and his father, Frederick, was sent to the West Indies because his uncle had died, and the widow, Rachel, was still there struggling to try to keep the family business going. So Frederick is sent by the family to try to help the widow of his brother, and lo and behold, they fell in love. And unfortunately, the local synagogue, it was a Jewish family, and the synagogue prohibited Frederick from marrying Rachel. So they struggled with that, had several children, Camille Pissarro being one of them. And fortunately, the King of Denmark, of all people, gave them finally permission to marry, and they did that. When I first read that about the King of Denmark, I could picture this cruise ship pulling into St. Thomas and the king getting off and saying, "Oh yeah, go ahead, get married." Pissarro himself, Camille Pissarro, was sent back to France for his education, then came back to St. Thomas and was really feeling restricted. He wanted to do more, spent 2 years in Caracas, Venezuela, and then finally moved on to Paris. He ended up marrying his mother's cook's helper, but only after fathering 3 children. So put this in context. I mean, think about, society norms and mores and so on. This is kind of a wild situation. He ended up studying with Courbet and Courbet. Of course, he was in the Salon de Refusé in 1863. He was a patient and really stable person. He ended up staying with his wife throughout his life. They had 7 children together. He was really a rock, even though he was initially, interested in exploring new art genres and pushing the limits of what was acceptable. All in all, he was really a steady person. He finally met Cezanne in about 1861, and here's Cezanne, self-portrait on the left, and a photo from about the time he arrived in Paris. And remember, he's coming from the south of France, from Aix-en-Provence. Was a childhood friend of Émile Zola. By chance, Zola's father was an engineer and was working on a dam in the area, and they became childhood friends. His father, of course, wanted him to study law. His father had started with very little, but had become quite a successful banker, and was expecting that Paul Cezanne was going to either go into the banking business or become a lawyer. And of course, Cezanne had no interest in that at all. He did finally get support from his father, and this father had the expectation that he was going to go to Paris and he was going to then have work shown in the salon. And he was going to be part of the Academy of Fine Arts, and that was, everybody was going to be happy because he would then be considered a successful artist. 3 years after the Salon of 1863, or the Salon de Refusé in 1863, these 2 examples of paintings by the 2 artists. Here's Pissarro, of course, with a nice idyllic rural scene. Again, remember, this is coming out of this is before explicit Impressionism, but it's coming out of the realism that was gaining hold and that Courbet would have been promoting. It's really a very nice painting. It's calming, it's soothing, it's looser, of course, than what you would have found by the classicists, and it's not as extravagant as what you might find from the Romantics, and it's a little bit looser than the realists by this time, but it's still very much identifiable as a scene along the river near Marne. On the right is Cezanne, the same year, and this is a painting of his father. What's so interesting about this is that, here his father kind of sitting awkwardly in this ridiculous chair, and he's reading, believe it or not, a left-wing radical newspaper that his father never would have gotten near. But Cezanne paints his father reading this radical newspaper, and of course on the wall behind is one of Cezanne's paintings decorating the house. But it's almost like he's thumbing his nose at his father. His father, agrees to support him and so on, and he lets him go off to Paris and follow his own interests. But Cezanne rather than treating it as in a more kindly way, is almost saying, I don't, I'm going to make fun of the person who's helped feed me. So the connections between Cezanne and Pissarro are also interesting, and we wonder how people who are so different in terms of their personalities can be such close friends for over a long period of time. Both of their mothers had some Creole extraction. They were both from different places, so when they got to Paris and they went into the studio with the other artists and so on, they were the ones who were the outsiders. They had noticeably different accents. Cezanne from Provence was, kind of essentially what we would consider maybe a hillbilly or accent that showed that he was from a different place and maybe not as sophisticated, not as well educated. And we know that he was abrasive as can be. He wasn't a pleasant person to be around. There's a great story of Lucien Pissarro, who is the oldest son of Camille, telling about going into the studio one time, and Cezanne was working on a painting, and there was a boat, and Cezanne asked one of the other artists, "What color should I paint the boat?" And one of the other artists said, "Why don't you paint it pink or vermilion?" And Cezanne turned around and just snapped at him, "Go F yourself." And apparently that was one of Cezanne's most common utterances to anybody for just about anything. So Pissarro and Cezanne seemed to gravitate toward one another, and I think Pissarro, being 9 years older, I think felt kind of like a father figure, or somebody who had to set an example and try to keep Cezanne under control. But they found this common bond between each other, and that made a difference. I just love this painting. Here's Pissarro, tall, big beard, ready to go out and paint outdoors, and he's off and is going to do great work for the day. Leaning against the wall in a self-hug is poor Cezanne, and probably grumbling about, oh, it's going to rain later, or it's too windy to paint outside today, or something. But almost all of the photographs where you see a group of artists or Cezanne and Pissarro together, Cezanne tends to be in this self-hug pose, and kind of in the background, or not looking like he's enjoying anything, and off to himself. A comparison of their paintings here later, after the first Impressionist show in 1874. We have Pissarro here on the left, and it's sad that slides and this kind of projection thing don't really do justice to the paintings, but what I would like you to try to see, if you can, is that with Pissarro there are literally thousands of small brush strokes. And if you look at the trees, you can almost see the individual leaves of the trees that he's painted. And whereas Cezanne, by this time, is beginning to flatten out. He's using a palette knife, and broad places where there might be individual leaves painted, here there are just kind of broad swatches of paint. In this area too, you can see, I think, more clearly that aspect of it. Something else that's very important, and that is, I think, that'll be more obvious in later paintings. If you look at the Pissarro painting, there's really great depth there. There's a three-dimensionality. The perspective, you almost feel like you can walk off into the distance. Whereas with Cezanne, you're beginning to see his his painting flatten out. It's almost more two-dimensional than three-dimensional, and he's more interested in these shapes and the sides of the houses, these geometric patterns within the painting, the structure. And one of the things that they both were striving for was to not be hampered by what had gone before and what other artists had done, other approaches to painting, but to approach the subject, whatever it was, whether it was a still life or a scene like this, to simply let the substance talk to them and have them respond in any way that they felt was appropriate. Cezanne became very interested in structure and kind of the building blocks, the sphere and the cube and the cone and so on. And his work became much more geometric over time. In the meantime, Pissarro is helping contain Cezanne's wildness and his kind of antisocial behavior, and he remained true to that, which is pretty remarkable. Even when other people, including some of the very influential painters, and Manet was certainly one of them, who was pretty outspoken about his dislike for Cezanne, Pissarro stayed with him. And over a period from the mid-1860s to the mid-1880s, they worked very closely together, particularly in the early 70s. They lived within a couple doors of each other in Pontoise and had quite a bit of contact. Interestingly, they never combined efforts to work on a project together. They never did a joint painting, and there are other pairs of artists in art history that actually worked together or kind of collaborated on the same work of art. Pissarro and Cezanne never did that. They always kept to themselves, but they would exchange ideas. And one of the interesting things too was that often Cezanne was the one that was more innovative and would kind of push the limits, but then periodically Pissarro would step in and kind of take the lead and try something new, and different style of brush strokes, or working with a different pattern of strokes within the painting. And they traded off. They kind of supported each other and compared notes, but they never actually worked on a piece together. But it's very unusual that for this 20-year period, they were very much together and comparing notes and exchanging work. They began, interestingly, as reactionaries against the salon, and then at some point they turned to begin to look forward instead of just revolting against what was going on. They began to look toward the future, and this idea of expressing the sensation of the subject became important for both of them. And I find it fascinating that they weren't stuck in that revolt and anti-establishment mentality, that they changed course and they did it together. And I would suggest that probably that partnership helped contribute to that turning it into something positive rather than remaining negative. Here is a painting, the same view. Pissarro painted this in 1871, and then Cezanne actually copied the Pissarro painting. He borrowed it from Pissarro and tried to do the same thing. And I think here it may be a little bit easier to see the difference in the patterns. You see the leaves on the trees, you see the trees themselves, the figures in the lane. And in the Cezanne work, exactly the same motif, exactly the same trees, the figures. He's copying the painting, but he's changing it dramatically. There isn't anywhere near the detail. The brushstrokes are very, very different, and it's again flattened out. If you can see the three-dimensionality of it. I at one point was going to, when I was working on my master's in art history, I was going to specialize in Chinese landscape painting. And one of the challenges in Chinese literati painting is that artists over the centuries copy one another. And it's very difficult to date paintings just by looking at them, because the subject matter stays the same. It's just, painted the same scene over and over again. And one of the, I guess one of the best ways to try to determine what the date of a painting is by how three-dimensional it is. And you see work that initially in the Han Dynasty is quite flat, and then it kind of reaches its peak in the mid-14th century under the Yuan Dynasty, and then it begins to flatten out again. And but it takes a lot of looking, and you have to be really skilled at being able to do that. And what's interesting to me here is that we see that same sort of evolution, that Cezanne is moving forward faster at flattening out, using broader, less detailed brushstrokes in the paintings. By 1874, another exhibition is put together, organized partly by Pissarro, but a number of other artists contributed to it. And Cezanne is thinking, I've had enough of this, I don't want to be involved with the group again, and tries to back out, but Pissarro brings him back into the fold. And this is the exhibition in 1874 that was really the beginning of the Impressionists, known as Impressionist. And it was a painting by Monet, Impression Sunrise, that the critic Louis Leroy wrote a scathing review of, that then gave them that name, and they accepted that and called themselves Impressionists. Here are a few of a couple of Pissarro's paintings. Again, I just find this so solid and so every inch of the painting is the way it should be. I just find this to be really intriguing. And this is one of his last paintings. He died in 1903. Pont de Carrousel in Paris, and again, even if he went to broader strokes and some work with a palette knife during different periods, by the end of his life, he's back at using very fine brushstrokes and truly is I think the quintessential Impressionist. In 1886, Cezanne's father died and left him a sizable amount of money, and he packed up and left. He got out of Paris, and remarkably, despite 20 years of working closely with Pissarro, he went back to Aix-en-Provence and didn't even say goodbye, didn't tell Pissarro he was leaving, he just left. So again, what a remarkable person. He became more isolated and focused, all the time, and, I wanted to, it's back here. I wanted to read a little an excerpt from a letter that Cezanne wrote to his friend Zola. Cezanne wrote that he desired nothing more than, quote, the most complete isolation, interrupted by a visit now and then to the brothel, but otherwise nothing else. And so here he is back in Aix-en-Provence, and talk about two-dimensionality. Look at this. We don't really feel any depth to speak of in this still life. And of course, the same thing then is apparent in his paintings of landscaped and buildings. These are geometric shapes. They're flattened. If you can see the brushstrokes that are here, they're often just broad and flat, and using color really only to differentiate depth within the painting. And then the motif that I just absolutely love, Mont Saint-Victoire, David and I were talking before about how many of this view he must have painted, but there were probably hundreds of paintings of this mountain in the region. And again, thinking back to whether it be Delacroix or Courbet or Ingres, what a difference in that period of time from the 1850s, early 1860s until 1900, and we're seeing this dramatic change in what is considered to be appropriate and avant-garde art. So the last years, in 1890, Cezanne went back to Paris and was in the exhibition of the 20. And then in 1895, Vollard, who was probably the most important art dealer in Paris at the time, put together a one-man show. Imagine, here's somebody that in 1863 is in the Salon de Refusés and people don't want anything to do with him. And by 1895, 32 years later, the top dealer in Paris is giving him a one-man show. And Pissarro, still clinging to this deep friendship and consideration, writes, Degas himself is seduced by the charm of this refined savage. Pissarro died then in 2003, and Cezanne died in 1906. Here's a wonderful part of a family portrait of Pissarro, his wife Julia here of all those years, and two of his 7 children. The young man is Lucien, his son, who became an artist in his own right. Two of the sons took up art, and I just love this painting because he's again, talking with the family. It almost feels like he's teaching them something. Look what I've done today, and this is why I did this and that. And that caring, selfless willingness to put himself out to help others just seems to show through in this photograph. And then here is one of the last photographs of Cezanne. He's probably just come from the brothel, and he's deciding to paint bathers, as they titled them. Again, he's sitting there contemplating, but looking kind of forlorn in my view of it. And so his influence is incredible. He died in 1906, and here is Picasso's The Girls of Avignon in 1907. And you can see, what a tremendous impact he had, even at that point. And Picasso, born in 1881, he's 26 years old when he's painting this, and to have absorbed that tremendous evolution and change that went on in painting over that 50-year period is pretty remarkable. And of course, Matisse, Braque, all the Cubists and Futurists absorbed this dramatic, really, change. You know, if you think about the realists and the romantics and the classicists, you know, there was certainly change. That was very obvious from the slides and the comparisons we saw. But think how dramatic from those three genres to what Cezanne produced, and then leading into modern art. It really is just incredible what happened. So my belief, and I hope that you will at least in part agree with me, is that this friendship between these two remarkable artists led to absolutely dramatic, remarkable changes, and that if it hadn't been for Pissarro, who knows, you know, somebody would have punched Cezanne's lights out sometime, or, you know, who knows what his future might have been if he hadn't had somebody who was able to provide that stability and the encouragement and the caring. So this is, I think, a wonderful story from art history. It's fun to go back and kind of review what transpired in the 19th century, and we had, you know, from the Industrial Revolution right up to the turn of the century in 1900. Certainly it was a remarkable and dynamic century, but it is borne out by the vast changes that occurred in the art world. So thank you very much.